Valerie Reyes was a 24-year-old woman living in New Rochelle in Westchester County, New York. She was born to Sal Reyes and Norma Sanchez, and was one of 4 siblings, with 1 older and 2 younger brothers. Valerie's mother described her daughter as a compassionate, intricate and selfless young woman who worked hard to enjoy the good things in life. In fact, people only had amazing things to say about Valerie and what an honestly delightful, loving and kind-hearted woman she was. She attended New Rochelle High School and as an adult was working at a Barnes Noble bookstore in Eastchester, a job she loved, but she was very creative and artistic and actually had ambitions to become a tattoo artist, like one of her brothers. She even let her brother practice his designs on her when he was learning his new trade, which definitely takes a certain level of trust. Valerie was a bit of a homebody. She loved to read, sing, draw portraits of her friends, and take long nature walks around where she lived. The Reyes family were all incredibly close and supportive of each other, and Valerie was no exception. She was very family-orientated, and Sunday was a day she always looked forward to, as that was a day she would meet up with her mum and siblings and they would play board games, go to eat or to the park, and be all silly and affectionate together and have some quality family time. Although she had been afflicted with bouts of anxiety and depression during her life, Valerie was mostly a fairly upbeat girl, so it was greatly worrying to her mother, Norma, when on January 28, 2019, Valerie told her that she'd been getting anxiety attacks, and that she was becoming scared and paranoid and was afraid someone was going to murder her. Valerie had broken up with her most recent boyfriend on January 24. Only 4 days before this conversation. So Norma asked whether something to do with this guy was making Valerie feel threatened. But Valerie said no, it wasn't anything to do with him. In fact, she wouldn't tell Norma anything more about what it actually was about, and left her mother with a pile of unanswered questions, ones that she'd never get to ask again, as that was the last time Norma Sanchez would ever speak to her daughter. Later that evening, Valerie exchanged a phone call with her best friend of almost a decade, Jeffrey Anderson. This conversation also seemed to be mostly about Valerie's current anxieties, as Jeffrey said he tried to talk her through her fears of being attacked, before saying good night to her at 11:30. The next day was Tuesday the 29th of January, and Valerie and Norma had plans to go to Home Depot together. But Valerie never showed up and wasn't answering any of her mother's texts or calls. Norma assumed that Valerie was just overtired and needed to sleep, especially after being so upset the evening before. So she just let her daughter be. But it wasn't just Norma who Valerie was apparently ignoring. None of her friends or family heard anything from her that whole day, when Valerie then failed to show up to work the next day. That was the last straw for her family. Not only was it very unlike her to not keep in regular contact with them, but it was unheard of for the very diligent and hard-working Valerie to ever no-show at work like that. Especially considering what Valerie had said only the day before about being scared someone was going to kill her. Her family just knew that something was very wrong. So that morning, January 30th, her family filed a missing persons report with the New Rochelle police. One of the first things police did was search Valerie's apartment. There were no obvious indications that a struggle had happened there, but forensic analysis was able to identify small amounts of blood in various places. A small blood stain on Valerie's pillow, 2 small stains on the bathroom floor, and another one on the toilet. But these were very small amounts. and weren't especially informative. Police also identified a number of items that were missing from Valerie's apartment, including her iPhone, her iPad, her wallet, and several items of clothing and bedding. These could suggest that Valerie had left of her own accord and so had packed some of her stuff to take with her, but her family and friends were insistent that she would not have just disappeared on her own with no contact. And that, combined with Valerie's recent concerns that someone had wanted to kill her, led police to believe that foul play was involved. An immediate person of interest was the boyfriend who Valerie had only just broken up with, as he could potentially have a strong motive to hurt her, depending on how he took this breakup. But he was fairly quickly ruled out as a suspect and actually took on a significant role in the search for Valerie. The police were looking everywhere in New Rochelle and New York City, with no joy, and so turned to the public for help, making sure pictures of Valerie and descriptions of the outfit she was last seen in, which was a green coat, black jeans and black shoes, were all over their social media. However, there were not really any proper leads until a week later. On February 5, it was 8:30 in the morning, and a group of highway workers were on a routine sweep of a public road in Greenwich, Connecticut, about 15 miles from Valerie's apartment. One of the workers noticed a suspicious red suitcase about 15 to 20 feet away from the road in the wooded area that ran alongside it. So one of these workers approached this suitcase, opened the zip, and then actually vomited from the foul smell that came out. Immediately, they called the police, without even checking anything more. When the police arrived, they discovered the suitcase contained the dead body of a young woman, which was confirmed 2 days later to be that of 24-year-old Valerie Reyes. Valerie was wearing jeans and an unbuttoned shirt, and was barefoot. Her knees and ankles were bound with a combination of white twine and packing tape. Her wrists were tied behind her back, and she had more packing tape wrapped all around her mouth and chin in multiple layers. As it had been there for 2 weeks, her body was starting to show the early stages of decomposition, with her hands and feet appearing rather mottled. She had a multitude of injuries around her head and face, including a cracked skull, a broken nose, fractured cheekbones, and a large hematoma. It looked like she had been badly beaten with what was believed to be just her attacker's fists. However, her official cause of death was ruled to be homicidal asphyxiation. The tape around her mouth and the injuries to her face would have made it more difficult for her to breathe anyway, and then being trapped in this suitcase that she only just fit inside would have virtually cut off her air supply. Considering the manner in which she was found and that the location was not particularly secluded, police were able to determine that Valerie had been killed or gravely wounded elsewhere before her body was moved to Connecticut afterwards. But who had done this? And why? This case was racked with more immediate drama when another one of the road workers who'd discovered Valerie's body, a man called James Clifford, began being investigated for taking and sharing photos of the body and the crime scene that he'd taken with his phone. This photo showed Valerie still bound and with an obvious gash to the head, and was considered a clear breach of privacy, both for her and the investigation. The last thing Valerie's family needed at this time was to be exposed to gruesome shots of their loved one being casually aired around to everyone Clifford knew. However, one of these acquaintances he showed the photo to, a Connecticut business owner, then decided to show this picture to a media outlet, the Journal News, and tell him all about where he'd got it from. So James Clifford was investigated by his department. but he ended up not receiving any criminal convictions, and instead a few fairly light sanctions, including a brief suspension and being made to attend sensitivity training. Due to the fact this case took place in 2 different states, the FBI was quickly called in to help with the investigation. At 5 a.m. on January 29, a few hours after Valerie was last seen, her debit card was used at a bank in New Rochelle to withdraw $1,000 from her account. The surveillance footage from in and around the bank was looked at, and showed a man wearing a black sweater and trousers and black Adidas trainers with white soles, and with his hood pulled up to hide his face. This man parked his car opposite the bank, entered the building, withdrew the money from an ATM, then returned to the Honda and drove away. An hour and a half later, this Honda was spotted again on CCTV at a New Rochelle intersection, and the license plate was recorded. When police tracked down this license plate number, they found this Honda was registered to a car rental company in an area called Flushing, in Queens, New York City. This car had been rented from January 28 to the 29th, so only for around the time when Valerie disappeared. The person it was officially rented to was quickly ruled out, but he was not the only person who could have driven it. Customers could add other authorized drivers to their account in a kind of car-sharing scheme, and one of these authorized drivers for this Honda was a man called Javier da Silva Rojas. When police had interviewed Valerie's friends and family, they had learned of the existence of a man named Javier, who Valerie had dated briefly in 2018, but who she'd broken up with almost a year before this case happened. Valerie and Javier had met through a dating website and gone out for 3 months before Valerie ended their relationship in April 2018. As was previously mentioned, this was almost a year before Valerie's death, so this, Javier, did not strike police as an immediate person of interest in the same way that her more recent ex had. But now, when police were looking up the full name of Javier da Silva Rojas online, and finding his social media accounts, they discovered his profile picture exactly matched a drawing that had been found in Valerie's apartment, confirming that he was indeed Valerie's ex-boyfriend. But why was her ex of almost a year using Valerie's bank card to withdraw her money in the middle of the night? A few hours after she was last seen, Javier's address was registered at a condo in Flushing, and police went to check it out on CCTV. They saw that on January 28 at 10:50 p.m., Javier had left his condo wearing the exact same outfit, all black, with the same trainers and hood that the man on CCTV using Valerie's bank card had worn, confirming that it was most likely him on the tape. Then the next day, at 9:45 a.m., Javier returned to his condo, but this time he was wearing a long tan-colored coat and was carrying a duffel bag. Several minutes later he left home again, this time without the duffel bag, so Javier had not been at home at the time when Valerie was attacked. He could be identified as having used her bank card hours before she was even known to be missing, and he had returned home in a different outfit, suggesting he'd got rid of the clothes he had been wearing a few hours previously. All of this was clearly suspicious. On February 6, the day after Valerie's body had been discovered, Javier went back to the car rental company in Flushing and rented out the same Honda as he'd used before. Google location data showed a large cluster of Wi-Fi hits on Javier's phone at a car wash in the Bronx, so he rehired this Honda, had it thoroughly and professionally cleaned, and then returned it to the rental company later the same day. Why would anyone pay to rent out a car then pay to have it cleaned, when it's not their car and they're just going to return it a few hours later? The obvious answer is to get rid of any evidence that might be in that car. Again, very suspicious but still not irrefutable evidence that Javier was responsible for Valerie's death. So on February 11, police from both the Greenwich and New Rochelle departments arrested Javier on charges of larceny for his use of Valerie's bank card, a charge that they could prove with their existing evidence. This arrest enabled them to not only interrogate him, but also get a search warrant for his apartment where they found Valerie's driving license and bank card in Javier's wallet, two things he would have no reason to have in his possession. A little background about Javier da Silva. He was also 24 at the time of this case. Same as Valerie. There is not a lot of available information about his background, but he was from what is apparently a comfortable suburban area in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, and had dual citizenship of both Venezuela and Portugal. He studied journalism at the Universidad Católica Santa Rosa. Before moving to the U.S. in 2017, Javier was partaking in a special visa waiver scheme where people from a certain list of countries could come and stay in the U.S. for up to 90 days without a visa. But when his time came to an end, Javier just didn't leave. At this time Venezuela was going through some serious political and economic turmoil, with a lot of shortages, a lot of unemployment, and a lot of intense protests. And Javier was one of many Venezuelans who wanted to escape this deteriorating situation. Once in the U.S., Javier set up home in Flushing in New York, where he worked first for a cleaning company and then in a coffee shop as a barista. He spent a lot of time traveling around New York, Washington, D.C. and South America, and he was very into nature and travel photography. He had a moderately large following on social media, especially Instagram. For the most part, people spoke very highly of Javier, saying that he was very thoughtful and kind. One of his former university friends even said he tried to help her get cancer treatment in the U.S. However, one person who was less of a fan of Javier's was Valerie's mother, Norma, who saw a rather different side of him. According to Norma, Javier was rather manipulative and controlling and would not take no for an answer. When they were dating, he had told Valerie that his mother was dying of cancer in Venezuela, which led Valerie to feel very protective of him. To Norma, this was just Javier trying to manipulate kind-hearted Valerie into feeling sorry for him so she would spend more time with him and capitulate to more of his ideas, basically make her more pliable for him. But it became clear fairly quickly to Valerie that Javier was way more invested in their relationship than she was, and this started to cause some real tension between the two of them. He wanted something far more serious than she was ready for at that time in her life, which is perfectly valid. But when Valerie decided to break up with Javier, he did not take it well at all, and became quite combative, to the point where Valerie decided to just block him on every platform. Javier was really destroyed by this, and even months later in September, he was still finding excuses to try and contact her. One time he messaged her saying he'd mistakenly used her debit card information and wanted to reimburse her, but Valerie refused to communicate with him except through friends as proxies. Texting said friend that she didn't want to talk to her or have anything else at all to do with Javier. After this, he finally seemed to get the message and left Valerie alone, or at least seemed to. The day after Javier's arrest, the police began his interrogation. He was not very honest, and gave a whole succession of unbelievable explanations for his behavior. Initially he said he had found Valerie's wallet on the street while bar hopping in Manhattan. He said there was a scrap of paper with the card's pin tucked inside the wallet, which was how he had been able to withdraw money using that card. He also said that he had not been to New Rochelle or Connecticut in over a year, and that he hadn't seen Valerie since early 2018. All of which could be proven wrong very easily with phone and location data. Eventually, Javier admitted that he had driven his rental car to New Rochelle the evening of the 28th, but insisted that he was so drunk that he'd blacked out and so couldn't remember anything else from that night. So the police questioned him some more, and even showed him photos of Valerie's dead body. After which Javier changed his story again, and tried to tell them that it had all just been a terrible accident. Javier's new story was that he had visited Valerie at her apartment on the night of January 28. Despite them not having been together for more than 9 months. He claimed the two of them had sex, during which Valerie had fallen and hit her head. Javier had then panicked, thinking that Valerie had died and that he was going to be blamed for it. So he tied her up with tape and twine that he found at her apartment to make her more compact. He put tape over her mouth so she wouldn't be able to scream. Then he put her in the suitcase, which was one the two of them had used for a holiday they had taken when they were a couple, and then drove around with it for a while before dropping it off at a random roadside in Greenwich, where she was found. He had then thrown her phone off of Whitestone Bridge before returning to his apartment, where he decided to keep her Kindle and one of her pillows. But this story didn't add up, for a lot of reasons. Firstly, Valerie had wanted nothing to do with Javier, and had severed all contact with him. If he had just randomly turned up on her doorstep at midnight, would she really have invited him in for sex? Especially considering her mental state and anxiety leading up to this day? No, probably not. Secondly, if he genuinely believed he killed her, then why would he be worried about her screaming to the extent where he would tape over her mouth in multiple layers? Thirdly, Valerie's injuries were just not consistent with this story. If she really had just fallen and knocked her head, then why did her face have so many bruises and fractures that were clearly from a sustained beating? Javier was unable to explain any of these inconsistencies, just blaming his panicked state at the time for all of his bizarre and sketchy behavior. Now he was arrested. Javier's phone and location history were thoroughly examined and his DNA was taken. And the results of these just undermined his story even more. A few days before Valerie's disappearance, Javier had texted a woman he appeared to be in a romantic relationship with that, "I just found my ex fucking in my bed with the guy next door in New Rochelle on December after years." Why would Javier have been apparently outside his ex's house, around 15 miles away from where he lived, months after they had ceased contact? Had he been stalking Valerie, since she wouldn't let him back into her life? He was clearly still very angry with her, and the fact he describes it as them being in my bed when he didn't live there suggests he still felt very possessive over Valerie and that he was entitled to a relationship with her. Seeing Valerie with a new partner may have caused Javier to become deeply jealous, and induced a "if I can't have her then no one can" mentality in him. When Javier left his condo on the evening of the 28th, he got in the rental Honda and used Google Maps on his phone to find the directions to a church in New Rochelle that was less than a mile away from Valerie's apartment. Javier then drove to New Rochelle just after midnight. His phone's location data showed that he was only 200 feet away from Valerie's home. After that, he switched his phone to airplane mode in an attempt to conceal his presence. Why would he feel a need to do that unless he was planning on doing something he shouldn't? It's unknown whether Valerie invited him into her apartment or if he had forced his way in. Traces of Javier's DNA were found on both a breast swab and a genital swab taken from Valerie. This would suggest they had some kind of sexual contact, though probably not consensually on Valerie's part like he tried to claim. They also found his DNA on the handles of the suitcase and under Valerie's fingernails, which backs up the idea they had some kind of physical altercation where she fought with him and tried to defend herself. He and Valerie had an argument that resulted in Javier attacking Valerie, beating her up, tying her up with a combination of tape and twine he found in her apartment, then putting her in the suitcase and the suitcase in his car. Valerie was still alive at this time. He potentially then cleaned up the crime scene, which could be why there was so little evidence found there. 3 hours later, Valerie's phone stopped pinging telecom towers, indicating that her phone had also been placed in airplane mode. Around the same time, Javier used Valerie's phone to go all through the contents of her iCloud, including all her notes, her photos, and her browsing and location history. He sat there doing this for well over an hour, while Valerie was trapped inside his car in this suitcase. According to the presentencing letter from the prosecution, after he'd thoroughly gone through her phone, Javier then logged into Valerie's banking app using her thumbprint to check her account balance. This suggests he opened the case enough to retrieve one of Valerie's hands, used her thumb to unlock the app, and then presumably retied her, or at least rearranged her back in the case and redid it back up. As she was found with her hands bound behind her back. Was she already dead at that time, when he's borrowing her body parts to try and steal her money? Did Javier realize or care either way? After checking her balance, he went to the bank and withdrew the $1,000 that got caught on CCTV. About 6:30 a.m., Javier's phone started pinging towers again, a whole succession of them miles apart from each other. He seemed to go through much of New York State, to Connecticut, back to New Rochelle, and then back to Connecticut again. He seemed to be driving at random, possibly trying to find the ideal spot to dump the suitcase. Finally he stopped in Greenwich, where he abandoned Valerie's body on the side of the road where it would be found 2 weeks later. It wasn't until he had returned to Queens that Javier turned his location services back on again, presumably as he no longer felt the need to hide his presence. Over the next couple of days, Javier used Valerie's bank card multiple times, withdrawing a total of $5,350 from her account, pretty much draining it. As previously stated, the police had identified a number of items missing from Valerie's apartment, including her phone, iPad, wallet and bedding. The missing bedding could have been used to contain or clean up any blood and mess created during the crime, and then might have been disposed of afterwards. We already know Javier had been the one to take the phone and wallet, and had later disposed of them. He'd also taken one of her pillows, just to keep, but he had also been the one to steal the iPad, which he then traded on an online marketplace for an Apple monitor and a laptop. Javier then took a photo of himself with his new tech, to show it off, and told his roommate that he had just found these items. This is one of the more callous aspects of this case. You've just killed a woman you presumably at one point cared for, and now you're selling her stuff to get new gadgets you can show off? Faced with all this evidence, Javier broke down and finally admitted to killing Valerie. They had got into an argument while he was at her apartment that led to him repeatedly punching her in the head, and he knew she was still alive when he put her in the case. Once he had admitted to the crime, Javier seemed to become very emotional about it. Some might even say remorseful. He cried through many of his interviews and court appearances, constantly apologizing and insisting he hadn't actually intended to kill Valerie and had in fact tried to revive her multiple times. During one jailhouse interview he said, "I didn't know what to do. I don't know what happened. I didn't mean to do it. I'm a bad person." She wasn't responding. I went and put my mouth on her mouth. I tried to put air in. When he was asked if Valerie had been bleeding, he just whimpered and cried some more, saying again, "I'm a bad person. I did something wrong. I didn't call the police, because," he said, "I thought they would blame me." He then said he drove around with her body not knowing where he was going. When he returned to Queens, he was pretty much just biding time waiting to be caught. And even claimed he withdrew that cash from Valerie's account to deliberately draw police attention to himself. Javier was charged with 1 count of kidnapping resulting in death. If he went to trial and was found guilty, he could potentially face life in prison or the death penalty. But this case took a long time to go to trial, partly as it had to go to federal court, as the crime had taken place in 2 states, but mainly because Javier's defense team kept trying to negotiate a plea deal for him, one that would get the death penalty taken off the table. His defense attorneys, the public defender team of Mark DeMarco and Jason Scher, tried to lessen Javier's potential sentence by portraying him as an otherwise decent man with no criminal record and a great reputation among those who knew him, but who had been forced to drop out of college and flee his home in Venezuela with only $600 to his name. In the time he'd been living in the U.S., he had kept his head down, working hard and being an otherwise model citizen. Though they didn't try to excuse the severity of his crime, they did attempt to make allowances for Javier by saying such a violent act was a result of him succumbing to stress, exacerbated by being separated from his family, and by an emerging drug habit. They referred to him as a broken man, someone who is sincerely sorry for his actions, understands the horrific nature of his conduct. Eventually a plea deal was reached and, on February 5, 2020, Javier da Silva Rojas pled guilty to the charge of the kidnapping resulting in the death of Valerie Reyes, and was sentenced to 30 years in jail, plus 2 years of supervised probation. In White Plains Federal Court, Judge Vincent Brichetti called it a brutal, callous, cruel crime. Valerie's mother, Norma, gave an impact statement at the sentencing, saying, "You deserve nothing but pain and rejection. I want you to hear the words of a mother who you devastated by taking away my baby girl." To which Javier apologized, saying, "No words can express how repulsed I am by what I did. I will never forgive myself. I cannot ask you to forgive me because I don't deserve it. I would like you to know I'm very sorry." When he is released from prison, Javier will be only 55 years old, although ICE has indicated that he will likely be deported back to Venezuela once his sentence is over. While Javier may very well feel remorseful for Valerie's death, it's still hard to accept everything he's said about this case. If it really had been, if not an accident, then at least a crime of passion he hadn't premeditated. Then why did he switch his phone to airplane mode before going in? It was midnight. He probably wasn't going to get any calls or interruptions. Personally, I believe Javier was furious at Valerie for moving on from him. While the plan might not have been to kill her, I believe he did go there intending to cause her harm. Essentially, punish her for daring to leave him. The attack itself and the aftermath seemed fairly improvised, making use of whatever he could find in her apartment, like the case and the tape, etc. If you want to be a real armchair psychologist, you could suggest that the underlying reason he took such effort to put Valerie in the suitcase was because he didn't want to look at her, or didn't want to look at the consequences of his behavior, like an out of sight, out of mind attitude. Transporting a suitcase is definitely less personal and more removed than physically handling the dead body of the woman you killed. In the many hours afterwards when he was alone with Valerie's body and his own thoughts, I can believe he might have had very mixed feelings about what he had done, and potentially did regret it. But if he was genuinely remorseful enough to the extent that he'd try and leave clues for the police to catch him, then why would he not just hand himself in after it happened and save Valerie's family the weeks of searching for her and then trying to get her justice? Rather than what he did do, which was take steps to cover up what he'd done, destroy any evidence he could, and take actions that would have had no purpose except material gains for him, such as exchanging Valerie's property for tech he preferred. But what do you think? Do you believe Javier always intended to kill Valerie that night? Why did he take the actions he did before and after the crime? Do you believe his remorse is genuine? Sources: